At 9:35 a.m. on January 11, 1945, two American fighter planes skimmed low over the jungles of northern Luzon in the Philippines. Captain William Bill Shomo tightened his grip on the control stick of his F-6D Mustang, a photo-reconnaissance version of the famed P-51. Suddenly, through breaks in the clouds, he spotted glints of sunlight on aluminum above enemy aircraft. He counted 13 Japanese planes, a single G-4M Betty bomber escorted by a dozen fighters. Shomo's heart pounded. 13 against 2. Any sane pilot would radio for help or slip away unseen. But Shomo wasn't just any pilot, and this wasn't just any day. Up to now, his own comrades had mocked his plane as a toy. The F-6D carried cameras for reconnaissance, not heavy bombs or rockets. It was a sleek silver Mustang many saw as a fancy photo plane, not a real fighter. Shomo's unit was nicknamed the Photo Squadron, flying long missions with film and flash as their ammunition. Some fighter jocks in more advanced squadrons smirked that Shomo's Mustang was just a camera-mounted Mattel toy, rather than a warplane built for battle. Yet in mere minutes on this January morning, that toy would unleash a firestorm. By the time the smoke cleared, 7 Japanese aircraft were spiraling out of the sky in flames, and Captain Shomo would achieve one of the most extraordinary feats of World War II. The men who had laughed at his plane would never laugh again. In under 6 minutes, Bill Shomo shot down 7 enemy planes, becoming an ace in a day. In 3 months, he would be standing on an airfield receiving the Medal of Honor for this single mission. But on the morning of January 11th, 1945, none of that glory was evident. Bill Shomo was a frustrated 26-year-old pilot who had never before been in an air-to-air dogfight. He was flying an aircraft many considered a lightweight afterthought of the war, lugging a camera where others carried bombs, and he was about to show the world exactly what that toy airplane and its unheralded pilot could do. Bill Shomo wasn't supposed to be a hero. In fact, he wasn't even supposed to be a fighter pilot. Born in 1918 in the small town of Jeannette, Pennsylvania, Shomo's early life gave no hint of the daring aviator he'd become. In his youth, he trained for an unusually quiet profession. He studied to be a mortician, attending embalming college in the late 1930s. By the age of 22, he was a licensed undertaker preparing the dead for burial. A far cry from the adrenaline and danger of aerial combat. War, however, has a way of changing destinies. When the United States entered World War II, Shomo decided he didn't want a life measured in funerals. He enlisted as an aviation cadet in August 1941, swapping his embalmer's suit for an Air Corps uniform. If America was going to war, Bill Shomo was determined to fight. Not from behind a desk or with a hearse, but in the skies with guns blazing. Shomo earned his pilot's wings and commission in March 1942, just as the United States was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Like thousands of new pilots, he dreamed of flying frontline fighter planes into battle, but the military had other plans for Lieutenant Shomo. He was assigned to the 82nd Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 5th Air Force, and shipped off to the Southwest Pacific area in late 1943. Instead of a shiny new P-51 or thundering P-47, Shomo found himself in the cockpit of an outdated Bell P-39 Airacobra. The Airacobra was an odd little fighter with its engine mounted behind the pilot and car-like doors. It lacked the high-altitude performance of other fighters and was considered obsolete by 1943 standards. "So I'm going to war in a car with wings," Shomo might have thought wryly as he clambered into the stubby-nosed P-39 for the first time. The Airacobra had a 37mm cannon in its nose and a tendency to stall above 15,000 feet, hardly the thoroughbred dogfighter pilots fantasized about. From late 1943 through 1944, Lieutenant Shomo's war was long on flying hours but short on glory. He and the Straffin Saints of the 82nd Recon Squadron hopscotched from one primitive jungle airstrip to another, Dobodura, Sidor, Taji in New Guinea, then up to Biak Island and the Dutch East Indies. Their mission was to photograph enemy positions and strafe ground targets, supporting General MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. It was necessary, hazardous work, roaring in low over enemy beaches to snap photos or rake anti-aircraft emplacements with machine gun fire. But it wasn't the sort of glamorous aerial combat Shomo had envisioned. The P-39s and hand-me-down P-40 Warhawks they flew were too short-range to reach the air-to-air combat action where every true fighter pilot wants to be. While P-38 Lightning Aces and P-47 Thunderbolt jocks up the coast tangled with Japanese Zeros and made headlines, Shomo's unit was stuck photographing and shooting up ground targets. Hazardous work, but not very satisfying for a fighter pilot. In other words, they were doing a vital job with old planes far from the spotlight. Bill Shomo tried to make the best of it. He became an expert at flying low and fast, hugging terrain to avoid flak. He learned patience and precision, qualities that would serve him well later. But as 1944 wore on, frustration mounted. 16 months into his Pacific tour, Shomo had never seen a Japanese plane from his cockpit. He logged over 200 combat missions without a single chance to dogfight an enemy aircraft. The war seemed like it might end without him ever firing his guns at an enemy in the air. Each day he dutifully flew reconnaissance, snapping photos of jungle roads and enemy supply dumps. Each night he watched other squadrons' pilots toast the day's victories in the mess hall, swapping stories of aerial duels he could only imagine. Shomo was a fighter pilot with no air fights, a hunter kept leashed, while his prey roamed free in distant skies. The toy airplane jibes didn't help morale. Other units knew the 82nd Reconnaissance Boys rarely saw action in the air. A running joke spread around 5th Air Force airfields. If you see a Jap fighter, send in Shomo's boys. Their cameras will frighten them to death. Shomo's P-39, with its stubby wings and awkward profile, was sometimes dismissed as a tinker toy of fighters. The Aerocobra's peculiar appearance, a nose cannon and a cockpit door, made it the butt of many a hangar joke. One popular wisecrack: the P-39 can do everything a fighter should, except climb, sprint, or win a fight. Shomo bit his tongue and kept flying, confident in his own skills if only the opportunity would come. Still, one has to imagine him gazing at the bullet holes in his aircraft's belly after a dangerous strafing run and thinking, I'd trade all these ground targets for one crack at a 0-up where it's a fair fight. That chance nearly came at a terrible cost in September 1944. Shomo was leading a 4-plane formation of P-39s on an armed recon mission on September 2nd, 1944, when they hit foul weather over the New Guinea mountains. Blinded by rain and cloud, 3 of Shomo's wingmen vanished into the storm. They never made it back. All 3 Aerocobras went missing in the weather, and Shomo was the sole survivor who managed to return to base. He had lost friends and fellow pilots that day without a single shot being fired. A stark reminder that war could kill you without the enemy even showing his face. It was a demoralizing incident. Shomo, the ever-ready fighter pilot who hadn't fired a shot in anger, was nearly taken out by Mother Nature instead. He returned to base alone, likely shaken, yet determined. Fate, it seemed, owed Bill Shomo an encounter with the enemy. And soon. By late 1944, the war finally began to tilt in Shomo's favour. The Army Air Forces recognised that the old P-39s and P-40 in the recon units just weren't cutting it. If recon pilots were going to venture deep into enemy territory, they needed better aircraft with longer range and higher performance. In December 1944, Shomo's outfit received an upgrade that made every man grin. Brand new North American P-51D Mustangs, modified into F-6D photo-reconnaissance fighters. This was the machine pilots had dreamed of. 1,490 horsepower of Packard Merlin engine up front, a top speed of approximately 440 miles per hour, and agility to rival anything in the sky. The F-6D variant carried an oblique camera for intelligence gathering, but crucially it still packed its 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber Browning machine guns. In other words, it could shoot photos and shoot bullets, and do both extremely well. To Bill Shomo, the arrival of the Mustang must have felt like being reborn as a fighter pilot. It looked like a rocket ship compared to the old Aerocobra, he said later perhaps. The P-51 had double the range of his P-39, meaning at last he could roam far beyond the front lines in search of trouble. Still, Shomo had to familiarise himself with the new plane quickly. In fact, he had only flown a handful of training flights in the Mustang, just 5 or 6 hops, before being thrust into combat with it. By Christmas 1944, Shomo, now promoted to captain, was given command of the 82nd Tactical Recon Squadron. He led his unit to a forward airstrip on Mindoro Island in the Philippines, just in time to support MacArthur's invasion of Luzon. The timing was perfect. The biggest battles of the Philippines campaign were underway, and Japanese planes were still active in the skies, desperate to strike back at the invading US forces. Captain Shomo's first chance to prove himself came on January 9th, 1945. That morning, the same day US troops landed at Lingayen Gulf, he led a low-level reconnaissance mission over northern Luzon. As Shomo's two-ship Mustang flight streaked toward Tuguegarao airfield, he finally sighted an enemy airplane in flight, the first he'd ever seen while airborne. It was a lone Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber on final approach to land. Shomo didn't hesitate. He swooped down behind the unsuspecting enemy and pressed the trigger for the very first time in air-to-air combat. 6 heavy .50 caliber machine guns erupted, converging on the Val. A short burst of tracers and armor-piercing rounds tore into the Japanese bomber's engine and cockpit. Within seconds, the Val burst into flames and crashed just short of the runway. Shomo had scored his first aerial victory with a single well-aimed burst. After 16 months of waiting, he was finally on the scoreboard. One can imagine his triumphant shout over the radio as the Val plummeted, "Got him!" It was a small taste of the success he craved, and it only sharpened his appetite for more. 2 days later, January 11th, 1945, dawned clear and bright. The day Bill Shomo's life would change forever. Now a double ace in ground attack, but with just one air victory, he was eager to find more enemy aircraft. That morning, Shomo and his wingman, Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb, took off from Hill Airfield, Hammer, on Mindoro for another long recon sweep. Their orders: conduct an armed photographic and strafing mission over Japanese airfields in northern Luzon. In simple terms, they were to fly alone over enemy territory, take pictures of airfields at Tuguegarao, Apari and Lawag, and shoot up any targets of opportunity. It was risky. Just 2 Mustangs ranging far from help, but by now Shomo had a keen sense for how to pick his fights and when to run. For over an hour, the 2 Mustangs zigzagged across Luzon's northern valleys. They flew on the deck just above the treetops to avoid detection by Japanese radar and spotters. By roughly 9:30 a.m., they were near Tuguegarao, where Shomo had downed the Val 2 days prior. The sky was mostly clear, dotted with broken clouds around 2,500 feet. As Shomo scanned the horizon, a flicker of movement caught his eye above. "Bogies, 10 o'clock high!" Up through a gap in the clouds, Shomo saw the silhouettes of multiple aircraft heading south. They weren't American. This was deep behind Japanese lines. In a flash, Shomo realized he'd stumbled upon what every fighter pilot longs for, a sky full of enemy planes ripe for ambush. He quickly rocked his wings at Lieutenant Lipscomb and pointed up. There was no time to count the enemy formation precisely, but Shomo could see it was large. At least a dozen fighters escorting a bomber. The American duo dove into a nearby cloud, using it to mask their climb. Then Shomo hauled back on the stick, opening the throttle of his Merlin engine to full military power. The Mustang roared upward in a steep Immelmann turn, a half-loop upward followed by a roll that brought them above and behind the enemy formation. Emerging from the clouds, Shomo and Lipscomb had executed a perfect surprise maneuver. One moment they were invisible under the enemy, the next they popped out behind them with the sun at their backs. Now the Japanese planes were directly in Shomo's sights at close range. In that instant he took stock. 11 Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighters and 1 Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo were weaving protectively around a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber in the center. The Betty was likely a command transport carrying high-ranking officers, given such a heavy escort. Later reports suggested a Japanese general might have been aboard that bomber, which would explain the phalanx of fighters. Shomo had no time to ponder. All he saw was a sky teeming with enemy aircraft. Targets, 13-2. The odds were absurd, but Captain Shomo felt zero fear. This is what he had been waiting and training for. All his frustration, his lost friends, the jibes about his toy airplane. It all focused into a cold, clear determination. Attack. "Drop tanks, let's get 'em," Shomo barked into his radio. Both Mustangs jettisoned their auxiliary fuel tanks, instantly lightening the aircraft for battle. The Japanese still hadn't seen them. They cruised along, unaware death was diving out of the sun behind them. Shomo's lips set in a thin line as he closed in at over 300 miles per hour from the rear. At around 40 yards, so close he could see the red meatballs painted on the enemy wings, Shomo pressed his triggers. 6.50 caliber guns erupted with a thunderous brrrr, spitting out armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of 3,000 rounds per minute. His first target was the trailing Ki-61 Tony in the formation's third section. The Tony never stood a chance. Caught completely by surprise, it took the full concentrated burst in the fuselage and exploded in midair, pieces of wing and tail scattering. Shomo's Mustang blasted right through the fireball of debris. Kill number 1 in the bag. Without pausing, Shomo lined up on a second Tony. This one was sliding into a defensive turn, but Shomo anticipated the move, rolled left and raked the enemy from wingtip to cockpit. The Ki-61 burst into flames and spiraled down toward the jungle. 2 down. By now the sky was chaos. Japanese pilots were shouting in surprise and breaking formation. Black puffs of 20mm cannon fire from the escorts began crisscrossing the sky as they realized they were under attack. Shomo spotted a third Tony trying to climb away to his right. He swung over, pulled the nose up slightly and gave a short burst. Tracers walked up the Tony's belly and it blew apart. Kill number 3. In perhaps 60 seconds, Captain Shomo had destroyed 3 enemy fighters, more than most pilots might claim in a month, but he was only warming up. Lieutenant Lipscomb, right behind Shomo, had opened fire as well. Taking advantage of the surprise, Lipscomb drilled a Ki-61 that crossed his path, sending it down smoking. The 2 Americans sliced through the formation like a pair of scissors, sowing confusion. Shomo zoomed out ahead of the enemy formation for a brief moment, then pulled up into a vertical climb to reposition. Below him, Japanese planes wheeled in panic. The Betty bomber, which had been their ward, was now exposed and already turning to flee, its pilot likely pushing the throttles in alarm. Shomo pivoted and dove back toward the center of the action, straight at the big Betty bomber from above and behind. The green camouflage twin-engine Betty loomed in his gun sight. Shomo knew the Betty bristled with defensive guns, a 20mm cannon in the tail and machine guns in the dorsal and waist positions, but he also knew the bomber was his big prize. He decided to attack from below, a vulnerable blind spot for the Betty's gunners. Shomo yanked the Mustang into a half roll and dove under the Betty's belly. As he pulled up directly beneath it, he opened fire. Heavy bullets tore into the bomber's belly and right engine. In seconds, the Betty's underside was a line of fire. Shomo's rounds likely ignited its fuel tanks. The lumbering bomber shuddered and began to fall, trailing smoke and flame. Shomo roared past it, pulling up and over to avoid collision. The doomed Betty rolled onto its back and plunged earthward, headed for a fatal crash landing. Indeed, it would explode in flames as it hit the ground a moment later. As Shomo pulled up from his attack on the bomber, a warning shout crackled in his headset. The Ki-44 Tojo, the one Japanese fighter that was not a Ki-61 in this group, had latched onto his tail. The Tojo was a fast-climbing interceptor, and its pilot had recovered from the surprise, diving after Shomo with cannons blazing. Tracers whizzed past Shomo's canopy, and a few clanged off his Mustang's tail. Shomo grimaced. One well-aimed burst from that 40mm cannon could shred his toy plane to bits. But instead of jinking away, Shomo did something gutsy and unconventional. He went vertical again. He pulled his Mustang into a tight spiral climb, essentially a corkscrew straight up. The more powerful P-51 accelerated upward, its Merlin engine howling. The Japanese Tojo pilot followed, determined to get a kill. He aimed up at Shomo and continued firing in long bursts. But as the duel spiraled into the sky, physics took over. The Tojo's angle became steeper, its speed bleeding off. The Japanese pilot tried to follow Shomo's tight upward spiral just a few seconds too long. His heavier Ki-44 stalled out. Its engine coughed and the aircraft flipped onto its back, falling into the clouds below. Shomo had literally climbed out of his enemy's reach, forcing the Tojo to lose control. He didn't bother diving after it. That fighter was effectively out of the fight for now, and he had other targets in sight. In the span of perhaps 2 to 3 minutes, Shomo had already downed 3 fighters and 1 bomber. Lipscomb had gotten 1 or 2, and at least 6 or 7 Japanese planes remained, now scattered and alarmed. Some of the remaining Tony pilots, seeing their bomber blow up on the ground, lost their will to fight. 2 of them broke formation and dove toward the hills at full throttle, skimming the treetops to escape. But Shomo wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Leveling off after his steep climb, Shomo spotted 2 enemy fighters still near the now-burning bomber wreck below. These were likely the last 2 Tonys that had stuck close to their bomber even as it went down. Perhaps they were escorting it in a forlorn hope it could belly land. Now, with the Betty exploded, they seemed to be disengaging, flying low. Shomo pounced. He rolled his Mustang over and dove almost vertically directly down onto the 2 Tonys from behind. They were only a few hundred feet off the ground, trying to sneak away fast and low. But a P-51 in a dive was one of the fastest things in the sky. Shomo closed the gap in seconds. The first Tony grew large in his gun sight. 0-0. He pressed the trigger, and a short burst ripped out. Impact! The Ki-61's rear fuselage was shredded by the half-inch bullets, and it crashed in flames almost immediately. Shomo then ever so slightly banked and tapped his rudder to line up the last Tony. The Japanese pilot saw his wingman go down and jinked left, but Shomo anticipated it. He squeezed the trigger gently. Another burst. The 6th Japanese fighter took hits to its engine and cockpit, flipped inverted and smashed into a rice paddy, exploding on impact. 7 enemy aircraft down. And just like that, the deadly dance was over. In a mere 5 to 6 minutes of furious combat, Captain Bill Shomo had personally destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft, 6 fighters and 1 bomber. His wingman, Lieutenant Lipscomb, had downed 3 fighters himself. The remaining Japanese planes, the few that survived the initial onslaught, had fled into the clouds in terror, racing for home. Shomo circled above for a moment, astonished at the sight below. Wreckage burning in the jungle, black smoke curling into the tropical sky. He took a deep breath and finally allowed himself a whoop of triumph. The odds had been 13-2, yet he and Lipscomb emerged not only victorious, but completely unscathed. Shomo's Mustang had a few bullet holes, but nothing serious. The camera boys had just wiped out a whole squadron of enemy planes on their own. The impossible had happened. No one in the US Army Air Forces had ever scored 7 confirmed victories in a single mission before that day, and only one ever would surpass it, Navy Commander David McCampbell's 9-plane day in 1944. In the Southwest Pacific area, Shomo's achievement was officially declared unparalleled. The elation in Shomo's cockpit was quickly joined by a sense of almost disbelief. He calmly radioed in a contact report to base. "This is Shomo. Encountered large enemy formation. Engaged. Claims. 7 confirmed destroyed. Repeat, 7. One imagines a long pause on the other end, the radio operator thinking he misheard. 7? Surely he meant 1. But as Shomo and Lipscomb returned to base, the evidence of their victory was literally strewn across the Philippine countryside. American infantry units on the ground later confirmed finding multiple crash sites, smouldering hulks of Ki-61 fighters and the twisted remains of a Betty bomber. Local Filipino guerrillas, who witnessed the brief dogfight from afar, reportedly marveled at the 2 lighting-tailed American planes that fell upon the Japanese like hawks onto pigeons. When Shomo landed back at Mindoro and taxied in, ground crew swarmed his Mustang, eyes wide at the sight of 7 tiny Japanese rising sun flags freshly painted under the cockpit canopy. His crew chief, Sergeant Ralph Winkle, had the honour of painting those victory markers, and he could hardly keep his hand from shaking with excitement. Comrades who had teased Shomo's photoplane stared in amazement. The once scoffed at F-6D Mustang now bore more victory symbols than most frontline fighters ever would. The squadron intelligence officer hurried over as Shomo climbed out of the cockpit. "Captain, did you really?" Shomo, ever the modest man, simply nodded and said, "We jumped a whole damn bunch of them." Then he added with a faint grin, "The camera worked fine, but the guns worked better." In the photo taken that day, Shomo stands by his Mustang Snooks 5, nicknamed after his wife, or perhaps just an affectionate moniker, looking almost bemused, as if this was the combat he'd been held back from for so long. Lieutenant Lipscomb, the trusty wingman who scored 3 kills, likely got a hearty slap on the back. He too had performed brilliantly. The news of Shomo's one-day rampage spread through the ranks like wildfire. Here was a pilot from a recon squadron, flying an airplane many had dubbed a mere camera ship, who had single-handedly matched the victory tally of entire squadrons in one morning. The laughter about toy airplanes ceased abruptly. Instead, the 82nd Recon Squadron's Mustangs earned a new respect. If anything, Shomo's incredible success highlighted that in the right hands, and with the element of surprise, the pilot matters far more than the plane. The F-6D, camera and all, was still a P-51 at heart, and in Bill Shomo's hands it became a whirling instrument of destruction. For his extraordinary gallantry and intrepidity in attacking such a far superior force and destroying 7 enemy aircraft in one action, Captain William A. Shomo was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The official citation praised his initiative and heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. When Major General Ennis Whitehead pinned the Medal of Honor on Shomo's uniform at Lingayen Airfield on April 3, 1945, it was with a sense of awe. Shomo had become an instant legend. He was one of only 2 American pilots in history to ever achieve ace-in-a-day status with more than 5 kills, the other being the Navy's McCampbell. In the Army Air Forces, no one had ever done what he did. In the aftermath, Shomo's squadron even embraced the dark irony of his former occupation. Having once been a mortician, Shomo quipped that he had sent a lot of Japs to meet their maker that day. He went on to name his next aircraft the Flying Undertaker, complete with nose art featuring a Grim Reaper, and he adopted a macabre motto, You fly 'em, I'll bury 'em. The press back home ran headlines about the one-man Air Force and the picture pilot, who could shoot down the enemy as well as he could shoot film. After so long in obscurity, Bill Shomo finally got his due. And what of the war after that blistering January morning? In truth, by early 1945, Japan's air power was waning. Shomo's feat underscored that many Japanese units were now forced to fly with inexperienced pilots who were outmatched by seasoned Americans. The loss of 13 aircraft, including the VIP-carrying bomber, in one engagement was a severe blow to the Japanese in Luzon. It left a gaping hole in their already thinned air defences. Some Japanese officers reportedly refused at first to believe a single pair of enemy fighters could inflict such losses. But the proof was on the ground, and survivors' testimonies confirmed the humiliating truth. Bill Shomo stayed in the fight through the Philippines campaign, but he never saw another enemy plane after January 11th. In total, he only ever encountered 14 enemy aircraft in his entire wartime flying career, and he shot down 8 of them. It's a startling ratio that speaks to lethal efficiency. Shomo himself humbly credited his success to getting in close, within 40 yards, and not wasting ammo on wild deflection shots. He had honed his marksmanship on those countless strafing runs, and it paid off in spades when it mattered. I didn't stop to count odds or wonder if I should disengage, he reflected. I just went in until my guns were empty. His Medal of Honor was a testament not just to one spectacular mission, but to the years of unseen duty leading up to it. The discipline, the frustration, and the unwavering readiness to seize the moment when it finally arrived. After the war, Shomo, now a national hero, continued serving in the newly formed US Air Force, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1968. But he always remained a modest figure. In interviews, he sometimes chuckled at the improbability of his own story. From mortician to Medal of Honor aviator, from flying a derided toy plane to achieving one of the greatest aerial victories of the war. It sounded almost like pulp fiction. But it was very real. Decades later, younger pilots would shake his hand, eyes wide, and ask how he did it. Shomo's answer was invariably along the lines of, right place, right time, and I knew what I was doing. On that January morning, Captain Bill Shomo turned a reconnaissance sideshow into a front-page triumph. He proved that even the most underestimated pilot and aircraft can have their day of destiny. The next time someone snickered at a photo pilot or a plane with a camera bolted in, they remembered Shomo and his 7 smoking kills. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate the heart of a warrior, nor the potential of a plane, however humble, in the hands of a master. The men who once laughed at his toy airplane learned that in war, today's toy can become tomorrow's terror. In the end, Shomo's story is more than just a wartime tally of kills. It's an ode to opportunity met with preparation. For months he flew, fought bureaucracy, and battled boredom, waiting for his moment. When it came, he grabbed it fiercely, swinging his toy like a battle axe. In those furious minutes over Luzon, Bill Shomo finally got to be what he always knew he was, a fighter pilot through and through. And on that day, the fighter pilot prevailed against all odds. 7 enemy planes fell from the sky, and with them fell the laughter and doubts of his peers. What remained was the legend of the man in the toy airplane, who wasn't supposed to be there, doing what couldn't be done, and doing it anyway with a vengeance. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favour. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about the heroes who got forgotten. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these stories from archives and obscurity every single week. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here.